Hey guys, so today we get to talk about the last half of David's life. Last time, if you remember, we talked about the time that David was anointed to be king as a young child, as a young teenager, to the time that he was crowned king at the age of 30. So we talked a lot about cool things of kind of how his character developed, how he was convicted to honor the Lord and everything that he did. Talked about the drama between him and Saul, and all the way up to Saul's family, Saul and his sons being killed in battle against the Philistines, to where David hearing about it. And then you hear about the leaders of Judah coming to David and saying, we want you to become the king of Judah. So David, he talks to the Lord, he says, Lord, should I move back to the city of Judah now that they want me to be the king of Judah? The Lord says, yeah, you should go. So David picks up his family and his entourage, and they head to this town, the city called Hebron. All right, so right now there's some tension going on because now you have this one of the larger tribes supporting David as king. However, the rest of the tribes of Israel still support the line of Saul. So there breaks out this civil war between the followers of David and the followers of Saul's son, whose name is Ishbosheth. So David's army is led by a guy named Joab, who is a very controversial figure. There's times where you love him, then times you're like, he is a dirtbag. So he's very interesting. So Joab is leading David's forces, and then there's another army commander named Abner. Abner is leading the forces for Saul, aka Saul's son Ishbosheth. So there's a lot of battles that break out between Joab's forces and Abner's forces, and there's one specific instance that's pretty significant is when Abner is now retreating against Joab's forces, and he's running away. Now, Joab's had two other brothers. One of them was named Asahel. Asahel was younger, and he was known to be a fast runner. So he's in pursuit of Abner, and Abner keeps turning back and says, Asahel, leave me alone. You know your brother would be so mad if I have to kill you. Understatement of the year. So Asahel continues chasing Abner till he finally catches up. Abner turns around, and it says that Abner thrusted the butt end of his spear through Asahel, killing him. Obviously, once Joab realizes that his little brother's been killed by Abner, he's furious, and he swears vengeance on Abner. Well, later, Abner goes back to Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son, and Ishbosheth, he publicly shames Abner for something. So whether Ishbosheth is scared of something, or he's nervous, or he's just immature, or he might just be stupid, but he publicly shames his army commander, the most influential person who supports him. So what does Abner does? He's like, you're going to treat me like this after everything I've done for you? So Abner says, nah, I'm going to go and support David. So he goes down to Hebron to meet David. He publicly conveys his support of David and is promising his support moving forward. So David's ecstatic, thrilled. So Abner leaves the city right when Joab comes back, and he finds out that his arch enemy Abner has been there. And Joab tricks Abner to coming back to Hebron, and he pulls him off to a side street, and he stabs Abner and kills him in a time of peace. So what does David do? Nothing. David mourns for Abner's death, slaps Joab on the wrist, and then continues forward with being crowned the king of now a united Israel. Because shortly after Abner is killed, Ishbosheth hears about it, and so do some kind of low lives who want to gain David's favor. So they sneak in and assassinate Ishbosheth, and then go and tell David that they killed Saul's son. David, being true to his convictions of not laying a hand on the anointed of the Lord, aka Saul and Saul's sons, David brings justice to the assassins and has them executed. And that is when he is then united as king over a united Israel at the age of 30. Here is interesting here, right after he's united king, there's a little mention of how many sons David had that were born in Hebron. So they start listing off about 7 sons, and the interesting thing is the mothers of all these sons are women we haven't heard of up to this point. That we've heard, didn't mention these 2 women last time, but we heard of Michal, okay, who is Saul's daughter. There's an interesting story of how David won permission to marry Saul's daughter, but Michal is one of David's wives, and then there's a woman named Abigail, who also comes from an interesting story of how her husband at the time really ticked David off, but she stepped in and kept David from killing her then husband, who later died by natural causes, and David was impressed with how she handled the situation, so he married Abigail. So we've heard of those 2, and we'll hear about a third here in a little bit. So that's 3 wives at the same time, But then also in this little chapter in 2 Samuel, they list another 7 women that David is married to. So David had many wives, and I just find it interesting because they list up all these sons of David's wives that just happened in the city of Hebron. So he was in Hebron for a couple of years, but he spent the bulk of his reign in a town that he goes and conquers at this time called Jerusalem. So Jerusalem at this point was under the control of a Jebusite clan who was outside of Israel. This is kind of one of those remaining pockets of inhabitants that we talked about back in Joshua, back when we referenced of Joshua leading the nation through Israel. Like they never drove out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So David did this. He went up there and he kicked them out and he took over Jerusalem. Now Jerusalem became the center, the capital, you could say, of Israel. And David built a city there that took on his own name as the city of David, which was right outside the walls of Jerusalem. And that was his home. That was his center of power, his seat of power. His throne was there. And so this is now David's home in Jerusalem. And it's cool because we enter into like the high point of David's life. It says that he becomes more and more powerful, that God leads him to more and more victories against his enemies. And it does say like as his fame and his popularity spread throughout the region, it was of a result of the fact that the Lord of Heaven's armies was with David in battle, in the decisions that he made, in everything that he did. Okay, this is David's high time of being a king. However, it doesn't stay that way forever. We'll get to that here in just a little bit. So during this time, David makes a goal to bring the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle of the Lord into Jerusalem. So he creates this big pomp and circumstance of this parade, this procession coming down the streets into Jerusalem. They go like 100 yards and they stop and he sacrifices a bull in worship of the Lord. And they go another 100 yards and they sacrifice the bull. All the time they're playing music and they're dancing. And David, he takes off his kingly robes and he's out there kind of in everyday clothing, out there dancing like a fanatic before the ark. And like it's an amazing display of worship and his love for the Lord. However, his wife Michal, Saul's daughter, looks out the window and sees him dancing unashamedly, and it says that she's filled with contempt at David because he's making a fool of himself. And there's this interesting little dialogue between Michal and David when he finally gets home, and she says, "Oh, you must be proud of yourself for acting." She starts nagging him. And he turns around and he says, "You be quiet." He says, "I was out there worshiping my Lord. I was out there. You say I was making a fool for myself, but I will make so much more of a fool of myself. I'll become so undignified if I have to in order to worship my God." And so you see a little bit of David's heart and his passion for the Lord come up in that conversation. Okay, so shortly after that, David's chilling out in his beautiful home, and he looks out the window and he sees how there's still a tabernacle, that the place of worship is still in a tent made several hundred years ago by Bezalel and Aholiab. Remember them? And David is convicted. He says, "Here I am sitting in my palace made of cedar and stone, and the Lord's house is this tent that we've been using since the days of Moses." And so he began making plans to build a temple. And God spoke to one of the prophets at that time. His name was Nathan. He said, "Hey, go to David and tell him, it's like, hey, I'm so thankful that you are willing to build me a temple. You honor me by wanting to do this. However," he's like, "I've never asked for someone to build me a temple." He says, "But because you've shown so much dedication and so much loyalty to me, I'll make you a promise." He says, "Even though I don't want you, David, to build me a temple," he says, "I want to use your legacy to be the kings of Israel throughout all generations." And the amazing thing is, even after David passes away, you have Solomon still in the United Kingdom. The kingdom does divide after Solomon, but there's always a son of David sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. Always. Okay? And you might be like, well, doesn't something change with Babylon and Syria? Yeah, so they get taken out, but the line of David is always considered the king of Jerusalem, and it's fulfilled all the way down to Jesus, who is the son of David, and Jesus is the eternal King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So even to this day, there's a son of David sitting on the throne, okay, the eternal throne, and it's a descendant of David in the person of Jesus. So that's a little side note. So David, he is incredibly humbled. Once again, this is the high point of David's life, that God is making him a covenant, just like he made a covenant with Abraham. He now renews the covenant through David, and it's just awesome. The next couple seasons we see of David's life are not obviously the high points. This is where it starts going downhill. We enter into several dark seasons for David. The first one we come to, we won't cover all of them, but we'll cover maybe about 3 of them. The first one we come to is in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And so we already mentioned David has many wives. Okay, he's now the king of this united nation of Israel. He's been very successful and victorious in war. Like, things are just going good for David. 2 Samuel chapter 11 starts with this. It says, in the spring of that year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent, okay, notice where David is. David sent Joab and the Israelite army out to fight. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. So normally, this time of year, the king and his army would all leave their centers of refuge, leave their homes, and they'd go out and fight against neighboring kingdoms, their enemies, their rivals, whatever. So here's David. Instead of doing what he's supposed to do, instead of doing what kings do, he sends his army out and he stays at home and enjoys the comforts of his home. Well, one particular evening, he has had a good day. He goes out on the roof of his house and he's walking around enjoying the sights when lo and behold, bloop, he looks out and there is, it says, a woman of unusual beauty is out on her roof, obviously not far from David's house, taking a bath. So what should David, a man after God's own heart, have done? He should have been like, ooh, my bad, and kept walking on his way. Instead, he stares, he watches, and then he calls one of his servants over and says, hey, who's that woman out there bathing? And the servant says, oh, that's you, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So this is another moment where David should have paused, like right in his tracks, and like, oh man, I know Uriah, because Uriah wasn't just this random dude that lived next to David. No, he was one of David's closest warriors, closest soldiers. He was considered one of the 30 of David's mighty men. And a few chapters later, it walks through David's mighty men. It's a really cool thing of just seeing the type of men that surrounded David. And at the end of that list of the 30 is Uriah the Hittite. Okay, so it wasn't like he was some random person that David had heard of. No, he knew Uriah. He had fought along beside Uriah. He had lived with Uriah probably when he was being chased by Saul in the wilderness. So it's the fact that not only is he now looking at this woman who's bathing, which he shouldn't be, but now he realizes that this woman is the wife of one of his bodyguard. And he's still looking. Not only that, he says, bring her to me. He takes the next step towards this desire that he has, that is unholy, that is ungood, that is ungodly. Okay, so they bring her name is Bathsheba. They bring Bathsheba to David, and it doesn't say how it happened, how long it happened. It doesn't give details at all. But eventually, the Bible does say, and they were intimate with each other. They did the thing, And David afterwards, she went back to her house. David thought it was a one-time thing, no big deal, no one's harmed, it's all good. However, Bathsheba becomes pregnant. Now David is filled with this fear and this worry that, oh no, this sin that was supposed to be just this one-time thing, the sin is now going to become public for everyone to know, because it would have been impossible for Uriah to have gotten her pregnant because he was off at war where David was supposed to be. So David starts thinking of, well, how can I cover this up? What can I do to prevent this public shame coming upon her for being an adulteress, and this public shame of me betraying one of my closest friends, associates, and also being an adulterer. So he recalls Uriah back from war, and so Uriah comes back to the king, and it's all under the guise of giving a report for the war, whatever, And so David talks to Uriah, says, Uriah, while you're back, why don't you go home, enjoy the luxuries of home, be with your wife, thinking if Uriah and his wife Bathsheba are intimate, then he will believe, and everyone else will believe, that the child of Bathsheba actually belongs to Uriah instead of David. He's trying to cover it up. He's hiding. So Uriah shows great character and integrity, because his response to David, he says, it would not be right for me to go and enjoy the comforts of home, to lie in my own bed, to eat of my own food, and to be with my wife, while my fellow soldiers are still out sleeping in the fields, away from their families, and having to scrounge food from the countryside. He said, it'd be wrong of me, so I refuse to do it. In this moment, Uriah had greater character than David did. So David had a loss of what to do. He wrote a letter to Joab saying, hey, let Uriah get close to the hottest part of battle and let him fall by the sword. And then he sealed the letter up and he gave it to Uriah to deliver to Joab. So not only did David sleep with Uriah's wife, but he also sent Uriah's death sentence in Uriah's hands to Joab, the commander. So what did Joab do? Joab obeyed the king, put Uriah in the heat of battle. He didn't even ask questions. He just let it happen, and Uriah was struck down in battle. When news got back to David and to Bathsheba mourned the death of her husband, but then David, after the period of mourning, took Bathsheba as one of his wives, thinking that everything was fine, everything was covered up. However, it wasn't hidden from everybody. It wasn't hidden from the Lord. So God talks to the prophet Nathan, I mentioned him earlier, talks to Nathan, and he tells Nathan to go and rebuke David. And so Nathan starts off by telling a story to David. He says, David, there was a rich man and a poor man in the city. The rich man had many sheep and many livestock, whereas the poor man only had one sheep. And to this poor man, that sheep was more than an animal. It was more than livestock. It was part of his family. It was like a son to him. He loved that sheep like a child. But one day a guest came to visit the rich man, and instead of preparing a meal from his own flock and his own many sheep, the rich man went over to the poor man's house, stole his beloved sheep, brought it back, killed it, and prepared it for a meal. When David heard the story, he was incensed. He lost it. And he cried out for justice for the poor man who was wrong and for the rich man to pay back tenfold of what he took. At that moment, Nathan stopped, interrupted David, and says, David, you are that man. And then he outlined where David had sinned, and he called David to repent of his sins, which David, to David's credit, David realized that he can't hide from what the Lord says, that he is guilty before God, because even though he may have covered up his sins from the worldly perspective, God had seen straight through into what he had done. So David, to his credit, completely repented and confessed before the Lord. And he humbled himself in fasting and prayer, because as a consequence of his sin, Bathsheba and the child both grew sick, and David fasted and prayed for them both to be healed and to recover. However, Bathsheba did, but the child did not. The child ended up dying as a result of the sickness. So Bathsheba and David both mourned for their son, and David, so the Bible said that David comforted Bathsheba, and then she again conceived a son and gave birth to a son who we now know as Solomon, who became David's successor. So this is the first really just dark season of David. The next one happened as a result of family drama between two of his sons, Absalom and Amnon. Absalom was the son of Maacah and David, and he also had a beautiful sister whose name was Tamar. Amnon, a son of another of David's wives, and so a half-brother of Absalom and Tamar. Okay, Amnon had a crush on his half-sister Tamar. He thought she was very beautiful. However, she was a virgin, and so Tamar just couldn't just go up to her like a prostitute. It was immoral, illegal, and not to mention just gross. It's his sister, right? So Amnon, from the guidance of a manipulative friend, manipulated events so that he could be alone with Tamar. And when he was alone with Tamar, he raped her. This is a terrible moment, because as soon as it was all done, the Bible says that he was filled with disgust, and he hated her more than he had ever loved her. The sin, the vile act that he did, turned his heart into this bitter rock filled with hate and disgust, and he turned all that hate and disgust towards Tamar. And he sent her out. He told his servants, throw this woman out, get her out of here, and lock the door behind her. He was disgusted, probably more with himself, but he turned all that disgust onto her. And this is the heartbreaking point of the story. I hate this story, because it says that she went out, she removed her beautiful clothes out of a virgin, and she put on, it says, sackcloth and clothes of mourning, and she went and lived in her brother's house, her brother Absalom's house, for the rest of her days as a desolate woman. Amnon, out of this awful moment of lust and just given into his temptations, ruined his half-sister's life. I hate it. However, what did David do when he heard? It said that he was extremely angry. That was it. It said David was angry. But it didn't say anything of what he did to correct the issue. It didn't say anything of what he did to punish Amnon for this sinful act that he did. It just says David was angry. I'm not a father, but I can imagine being a father of a daughter who had something like that happened, and there'd be swift justice on my behalf. And so it just breaks my heart that not only did she have to go through that shame, but that David, her father, didn't really do anything about it. So, however, her older brother Absalom was going to do something about it, and he was patient and he was wise, and so he waited 2 years. 2 years after this incident, Absalom threw a banquet and invited all of his brothers, including Amnon. So Amnon came, and Absalom had given instructions to his servants. He said, listen, when Amnon becomes drunk, I'm going to give you a signal. I want you to kill him. Sure enough, Amnon got drunk. Absalom gave a signal, and his servants killed him. Okay? All the rest of David's sons ran and fled out of terror, and Absalom ran to his grandfather, who was a leader of another nation. And so Absalom ran to another nation for refuge because he didn't know how David was going to respond. So he's there for a time until finally Joab, here comes Joab again, worked with David and manipulated some events to convince David to bring his son Absalom back to Jerusalem. David conceded. However, he said, I do not want to see him. So he can come live in Jerusalem, but he must never come before me. So Absalom comes back to Jerusalem, and after 2 years of living in the same city of his dad and never seeing his dad, finally David gives Absalom permission to come and see him. They are now reconciled. You think, oh, happily ever after, things are going to be good, things are going to be great. However, Absalom begins a strategy to start pulling power away from his father, trying to win the heart of the people. And he's successful at this, and he builds momentum. And then eventually he has enough momentum and enough clout with some of the leading officials of the land that he throws a full revolt, proclaims himself king, and then starts marching towards the capital to take his father, and essentially to execute his father. So David hears about it, and he flees Jerusalem with the rest of his family and his remaining court. And Absalom comes in and takes control of Jerusalem. This is a very low point for David. And there are several Psalms that are recorded in the book of Psalms that David wrote about this moment of being chased out of the city, being chased by his son. It's a very low point for David. There are a lot of details in 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 18 that kind of give scope of what takes place between Absalom and David. However, it all kind of sums up in this battle between Joab and David's forces versus Absalom and his supporters. So the battle turns against Absalom, and he begins a retreat. So he's riding on a mule, and this is an interesting little tidbit. Earlier, it describes Absalom as a very handsome, very beautiful man with long flowing hair. So this long flowing hair leads to his demise, because as he's fleeing on the back of his mule through a forest, his hair becomes entangled in some large branches. It pulls him from his mule and leaves him dangling in the air below the tree. Well, some of Joab's men finds Absalom, tells Joab about where Absalom is, and against David's direct orders, David literally said in front of Joab and all of the army, says, deal gently with my son Absalom. Joab walks up to the dangling, kicking in the air, struggling Absalom, and takes 3 daggers and plunges them into his heart, killing him hanging from a tree. Not what David told Joab to do. Okay? It was, once again, Joab, he's a controversial figure because he keeps going against the wishes and demands of David, but yet David never really punishes him or holds him accountable. It's very strange, the relationship that they have. And so David mourns for Absalom's death, and he's reacting so strongly to Absalom's death that the people now feel guilty for fighting against Absalom. Like they're confused. So Joab, once again, goes to David and kind of rebukes him and says, hey, pull it together. These people think you're ungrateful for the sacrifices they made. So David composes himself, goes, sits on the throne back on Jerusalem, and the people celebrate because the king's back. So that's not the end of his family drama. There's another moment when he's older in age, he's closer to the age of 70, right before he's about to die, to where another one of his sons, Adonijah, sees an opportunity, sees the weakness and the feebleness of his father, the king, and decides, you know what? This is my time to take the throne for my own. So he gets in cahoots with some of David's court. Joab is one of them. Once again, controversial figure. So Joab and a few others throw their support behind Adonijah. So they go down and they have this bigger elaborate ceremony. They do some sacrifices. They have a big banquet, and they proclaim Adonijah king. However, David is completely oblivious to what's going on. He's back in his home, and they said that David had become so weak and so feeble that he couldn't stay warm, regardless of how many blankets they put on him. So they go find a young virgin girl whose name is Abishag, and she comes and she lays with David. The Bible's very clear. It says they do not have sexual relations. So she comes and lays with David to keep him warm. And so David, as you can tell, he's old, he's feeble, okay? And now he's completely unaware that one of his sons is staging another coup to take the kingdom away from him. So between the efforts of Nathan the prophet, we've mentioned him a couple times, and then Bathsheba, they worked together to remind David that he had made a promise to Solomon, Bathsheba's son, that he would become the next king of Israel. So David is now made aware that Adonijah is throwing a coup, and he summons some strength, and he gets up and he calls Zadok the high priest, Nathan the prophet, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, who's the leader of David's bodyguard, and then all of David's bodyguard. They all come together and they take Solomon down to the springs and they anoint him to be king. And there's this big triumphant shout. All the people in Jerusalem are there, and everyone confirms the fact that Solomon is now the king of Israel. So Adonijah's party, they're finishing up their banquet, and they hear that David has appointed Solomon to be the next king, and that all these influential figures who held a lot more clout than the men who were with Adonijah had supported this. And so Adonijah's party breaks up in a panic, and they all disband. And Adonijah goes and he clings to the horns of the altar in the temple of God, and he begs for mercy from Solomon not to kill him, which he probably deserved. He deserved to be killed because he's thrown a coup against his father and against Solomon. But Solomon, with mercy and gracious and kindness, he says, "No, I will not kill you." He says, just don't do anything like this again. Just be loyal to me. Which, if you continue reading, there's some more drama that happens with Adonijah and Solomon, and he ends up. So, a lot of mercy, a lot of drama goes on here, and so finally, David's moments come to an end, and he is recorded giving instructions and just encouragement to Solomon before he passes away. I wanted to read a little of this to you just because I think it's good. Even though this is specifically spoken to Solomon, I think it's good for us to hear the same words that come from the man after God's own heart, and see how they can also apply to us. So this is what David says in 1 Kings chapter 2. He says, "I am going where everyone on earth must someday go. Take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep the decrees, commands, regulations, and laws written in the law of Moses so that you will be successful in all you do and wherever you go." David also gives them specific instructions on how to lead, how to build the temple. He also gives them advice on how to deal with men such as Joab and some other people that caused David difficulties and harm earlier in his life. So after this, the Bible records David peacefully dies at the age of 70, and he's buried in the city after his own name, the city of David, which begins a tradition of the kings of Judah all being buried in the city of David. So here we have it, David. David was a man after God's own heart. He did accomplish some amazing feats. He was known for some incredible stories of heroism, of exploit. He was just a man's man. He was a warrior. He was a poet. He was wholly in love with the Lord. However, he also had some really just not good moments to him, right? Adultery and murder, covering up his sin. However, he repented of it. He turned back to the Lord. He asked for forgiveness. Psalm 51 captures his confession and his repentance, and it's a beautiful example for us as men that when we fall into temptation, when we make mistakes, we can turn our hearts back towards God and seek mercy and forgiveness from him. He didn't do the best of job leading his family. Once again, another example of great men in the Bible who did amazing things for the Lord. However, they failed when it came to leading their sons and leading their families. He didn't have the same standards of accountability for everyone. Like one of his closest associates, Joab, murdered many people just because they threatened his status or because he didn't like them. So it's like, why did he punish Joab the way that he should have? It was so there's a lot of red flags that pop up with David, but it always comes back to the fact that David was a man after God's own heart. That David, when he was made known of where he had failed, when he was made known of his